Hey guys, welcome back to our VCP 6.5 ICM hands-on training. This is lab 20 in our series. In this lab, we'll go ahead and work with our DRS cluster. So DRS is Distributed Resource Scheduler cluster. We'll go ahead and take a look and we'll go ahead and configure the DRS cluster in this lab. This is the objective for this lab. We'll go ahead and work with the DRS and we'll see the reason why DRS. Why do we really need a DRS? Then we'll go ahead and take a look at how do we create a new DRS cluster. We'll go ahead and verify the DRS cluster functionality. We'll also go ahead and take a look at the affinity and anti-affinity rules. So before we go ahead and configure or work with the DRS cluster, I want to tell you a few things. So DRS is all about distributed resource scheduler. So the whole idea behind DRS is just to make sure the VMs or the capacity is balanced. That means all of the ESXi hosts are being used accordingly up to their capacity. Without the main thing is, the DRS cluster can rebalance your cluster without any service interruption. So that's something is pretty cool. But like now, how really it happens? So before we can go ahead and configure a DRS cluster, we need to make sure we have few things already configured on our environment. We need to make sure we have a good working vMotion. We need to make sure the VMs are sitting probably on a shared storage. And at the same time, we had configured basic HA. So DRS kind of relies on some of these things. So let's go ahead and see how we can make use of a DRS to really load balance within a cluster and how we can work with some of these things. So let's go ahead and log into our vSphere web client. And this is the cluster that we have been working. So in this cluster, we had created a HA cluster. In this, there are two hosts, 44 and 45. So let's go ahead and click on 44. If I go to the VMs, all the VMs are powered off. That's fine. Let's go to the host 45. And as you can see on the host 45, there are a couple of VMs which are right now in the powered on state. So if you take a look here, the host 44 is kind of sitting pretty much idle here, while all of the running VMs or all the workload is on host 45. So that would be a good choice when you want to make sure that all the hosts within a cluster are being used equally or are servicing your environment correctly, some of those things. And that's where we can go ahead and make use of a DRS cluster. Again, DRS cluster, as I said, once we had created a cluster, if you recall, when we were creating a cluster, we were presented with a option. So now come back to the cluster and we can just simply go to the settings again, which is nothing but the configure part. And within that, we can go to the vSphere DRS. And right now it says the vSphere DRS is turned off because what we had done earlier, we had configured the HA and you can see the HA is still on. So now let's come back to the vSphere DRS. And when we are on the vSphere DRS, just simply go ahead and click on the edit option here. Within the edit option, there are a couple of the options. So first thing, we'll go ahead and say, hey, simply turn on vSphere DRS. Is as simple as that. You just simply go ahead and create a cluster, and on that cluster, you just go ahead and enable this particular checkbox. In the DRS automation, there are a couple of ways we can have our environment being automated. There's a fully automated. That means we will let the DRS make their decision and run the DRS recommendation and then take actions on them automatically. We can have partially automated DRS automation where it can suggest you, it can recommend you some of the things, but it's up to the end user to go ahead and apply those changes. So in this, we'll go ahead and work with the manual. So we will run everything manually so we can see everything in action, and then we will go ahead and take some of the actions on some of those particular things. Let's go to the additional options, and within the additional options there are a few options that we can go ahead and configure. There is a power management and there is an advanced option. So now let's go ahead and expand the DRS automation. So when we expand the DRS automation, as I said, we will be working with the manual. There are a couple of the things that we can go ahead and configure here. So no matter what kind of automation level we work, there is something called a migration threshold. So let's go ahead and increase the migration threshold to be really aggressive here. That means vCenter will apply recommendation that perform even a single slight improvement to the cluster's load balance. If there is even a single slight imbalance in the cluster, we can go ahead and do that on the aggressive. So when you're working in production, you may not be really want to do really aggressive. You can adjust this threshold according to your need. But for our lab demonstration, we'll be changing this to really aggressive. So that's the only thing we need right now. So we just set the automation level to manual and the threshold is being really aggressive. Rest of the settings are looking okay. I don't have to make any change. So simply go ahead and hit here. So what we just went and did here, we went ahead and configured a cluster and we empowered or we turned on the DRS functionality on that cluster. And that's how we just went ahead and created our DRS cluster. Now the whole idea behind the DRS cluster is the automatic resource scheduling and doing some of the action on that one. Again, we can have our DRS cluster either in manually, partial automated or fully automated mode depending on that. So in the manual mode, the whole idea is, we will be able to review the recommendation which is optimal for our environment, and based on that we would be able to take some action in terms of the placement and make some of the changes. So now let's come back to your cluster. Now we go back again to the monitor tab, and within the monitor tab now we have another option that says vSphere DRS. So within the vSphere DRS there are a couple of options that says recommendation, faults, history. So with the recommendation we have an option that says run DRS now, because we had just configured our DRS cluster and we had configured it to be in manual mode. That means we have the full control. So once we go ahead and hit this run DRS cluster, that means we are forcing the vSphere to run the algorithm really to see if there is any imbalance within our cluster. If we don't run this by clicking this button, we would have to wait 5 minutes. So just to save a few minutes, I will go ahead and simply go and run the DRS now. So now, as you can see, refresh recommendation. So DRS cluster is running on our environment. So it should be a few minutes, and once that is done, we can come back and take a look at some of the other information. While I'm still waiting for an imbalance in our cluster, let me go ahead and show you meanwhile something else. Let's go ahead and right click on a VM and let's try to power on one of the VM which is in your DRS cluster. When you try to power on a VM, we are being presented with the recommendation to power on a VM. That means that's the another beauty when you have the DRS, when you're trying to power on, we are being presented with a recommendation, hey, maybe you want to power on this VM on this particular host and where you can take a look at some of the priorities and some of the other things. That's another good thing. That way manually you can also try to balance your cluster. So let me go ahead and try to power on this VM only on host 45. So let's just go ahead and simply click OK. You see the VM3 is sitting on host 45, and we know the host 45 is part of this cluster. So on this 45 right now we have two VMs being powered on, which is VM5 and a VM5 clone. Let's go to 45 and quickly verify that's the case. Yes. So there are two VMs, VM5 and VM5 clones are being powered on this host. And within the DRS cluster, if I go back to the monitor tab, and if you take a look on the recommendation, or let me go ahead and run the DRS one more time here. Right now it says, okay, hey, migrate this clone from 45 to 44, a balance average CPU load. So it seems the CPU load is quite high right now on this host. But if we come back to the CPU utilization, right now it shows, okay, hey, this is your CPU utilization. So let's go back to the recommendation. And meanwhile, let's go back to the summary. And if you take a look on the vSphere DRS on the summary page for your cluster, right now it says, okay, hey, this is imbalanced. Migration automation level is set to manual, and right now there is one DRS recommendation that we can go ahead and take a look here. So now if we come back, we can try rerunning the DRS again if we need to. But if you take a look at this stage, the CPU utilization is not very bad. It seems to be okay. Okay, now let's come back to the DRS cluster. If we come back to right now we don't have any recommendation, so let's try rerunning our DRS one more time here. So run DRS now. So now we can see we are being presented with the recommendation. We can always go ahead and select this one and we can go ahead and apply the recommendation. So we went ahead and just applied, and you can see the virtual machine 5 is being migrated. So now if we go back to click on 5, right now it got migrated from host 45 to 44, and that's how we can go ahead and run the DRS in the manual mode. So that's the whole idea, configuring the manual, where you can go ahead and run the recommendation manually and you can go ahead and apply them. Again, if you want your cluster to operate in an automated way, when we go ahead and configure the DRS, we can always go ahead and configure that instead of the manual mode. We can change it to maybe like partially automated or maybe fully automated, and that would take care of in terms of the recommendation and replacement of your virtual machine and some of the other things. We can go back under the monitor and we can take a look at our CPU utilization. Right now if you see we have the CPU kind of pretty much balanced out between these two hosts. We can take a look at some of the memory utilization also. That's how we can go ahead and work with the DRS. Now our DRS cluster is kind of balanced. So now let's try to power on the VM3. And now you can see we are being presented with the power on option. And on the power option, again, we are being presented with some recommendation. So let's go ahead and place this host right now on 44. That's okay. So simply go ahead and click OK here. And as you can see, this is being running on 44. So if I go on 44, so right now on the host 44, we have both VM3 and 5 being powered on, and on host 45, the VM5 dash clone. And if we go back and take a look at our cluster utilization probably, and at this stage it says, okay, hey, it seems the first one is more. So we can go ahead and run a DRS, manual DRS now if we need to. Let's go ahead and maybe try clicking a few times for it to detect if there is any change. And right now it's detecting an imbalance because we are just trying to bring up another VM. So let's go ahead and try to run the DRS now, maybe one more time, and see if we are being presented with any kind of recommendation or not. Right now it says, okay, hey, your DRS cluster is kind of balanced right now. So now let's come back to your host 44, and if you take a look on host 44, we have these two VM 3 and 5. So there are maybe a situation where you want to have some kind of affinity where you want to have a certain VM for some reason to be kept on two different hosts. Let's say maybe you have an application level redundancy where you don't want your both the nodes of a cluster. Let's say in that cluster there are only node for your application, both the nodes to be running on same ESXi host. In case of failure of that host, that would bring down your application level redundancy too. So in that case, we can go ahead and configure the VM anti-affinity rules, and based on that, we can specify, okay, hey, we want to make sure that these two VMs should not be running onto the same ESXi host. And for that, we can go ahead and create your rules. So in this case, we will be working with the VM 3 and 5 for that. So just simply go to our cluster. We'll go ahead and simply go to the settings of the clusters. So once we are on the settings of the clusters, let's go to the VM host / rules basically here. So if I go ahead and scroll down at the bottom under the configuration, we have this VM / host rules. So this VM / host rules right now, there is no rule into this particular cluster. So now just to add a rule, simply go ahead and hit add here. So within the rule name, we are being asked to specify a name. So let's go ahead and give a name here, VM3, VM5, and we can go ahead and simply enable this rule. Now there are different types what we can do in terms of what do we need to do. We can keep virtual machines together, or we can have the virtual machines to be separated. In this case, let's say if you want to do a separate, that would be anti-affinity rule. We can go ahead and certainly do that. If you want the VMs to be sitting onto the same host, we can go ahead and configure a VM affinity rule. So let's go ahead and configure a VM anti-affinity rule in this case. So we'll go ahead and say separate virtual machines. Now we can go ahead and add here the members that we want them to be running separate. So in this case, let's go ahead and select VM3 and VM5. Now once we good, everything looks good, just simply go ahead and hit OK here. Now we went ahead and applied some of these change, and you can see the cluster reconfig was just done. Now if we come back to the cluster, and if we come back to the monitor tab, within the monitor tab we can go back to the let me go back and click onto the, now we came back to the vSphere DRS tab, and then you can see automatically this time we didn't have to do any kind of a DRS run or anything. We are being presented with a recommendation where it says, okay, hey, migrate VM5 from 44 to 545, and that is because of the anti-affinity rule that we just created. Similarly, we can go ahead and create any kind of a different rules that we want. We can have a VM affinity rule. We can have a VM host affinity rules also, where we want to have a particular VM to be running on a specific host. We can certainly go ahead and do that, and we can go ahead and apply this change. So let's go ahead and apply this particular change. So in that case, our VM5 will get migrated from 44 to 45. Let's go ahead and do simply apply recommendation, and you can see the migration is ongoing. So now let's come back to the VM5. We should see this VM get migrated from 44 to 45, or from 45 to 44. So if I come back to my host of 44 and take a look at the running VMs list, on the running VM list we have only VM3, while on my host 45 I have 5. That way we have separated these two VMs onto two different hosts. So that'll be all for this lab. Hopefully you got the idea of configuring the DRS cluster. You can go ahead and configure a DRS cluster in the manual mode, partial automated or maybe fully automated, and then you can go ahead and work with these VM and host rule to have certain VM to be grouped together or keep them separate. That'll be all for this lab.